Welcome to 30 Minutes of Faith. We're happy to have Bhavani Girard with us, who is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Interfaith Council of Greater Sacramento and also an interfaith minister. Welcome.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Thank you.
Will you tell us about your childhood and where you were raised and went to high school and those kinds of things?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and the thing I remember most about the street that I lived on was that there was a great big cathedral across the street from my home. And I spent a lot of time there. I've just been a devout person all my life, and so when my mother couldn't find me, that's where I was. I was spending time with God. So that's really the most significant thing I would say about my childhood. Loving family. We traveled a lot, and as I say, I was born in New York and ended up back in California. And I'm convinced that this is where God wants me now, because I've been brought right back to the Sacramento area 5 different times. My mother always wanted to live in California. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she wanted to live here. And so little by little, she convinced my father, and we came out to California. That's when I was 11. Well, we lasted 3 weeks. My father couldn't acclimate to California. So we went back to New York. And when I was grown, married, my husband and I decided we would come to California. And my husband, being of an engineer type, he made all these scientific decisions about, the fault, how to live on the right side of the fault, and the climate, and the population, and everything. And I ended right back in Sacramento. And my brother was visiting, helping me to move here many years ago. And we moved to Roseville. And so he looked around after we finished unpacking, and he said, this place looks awfully familiar. And I said, I think it does. And so we started driving, and less than a mile away, we found the house we had lived in when I was 11 years old. So 3 other times that same thing has happened. I've been brought back to California, back to Roseville, over and over and over again. So I figure this is where God wants me.
Were you raised in a religious home?
Yes, yes. Again, it was more, it wasn't pushed on us in any way. It was just a sweet devotion. We're Italian Americans, and so our lives were filled with tradition. And so a big part of the tradition was our faith. And it was very natural. It was nothing that was, no pressure about it.
Do you still have a brother living or siblings living?
I do. We lost our sister, but I have my brother. And he lives nearby in Marin, so we're pretty close.
So a happy childhood, a happy adolescence?
Yes, I would have to say. I did not seriously suffer in any way. I think in large part, though, because I had a strong core. So what other people might have gone through and considered that suffering, I didn't.
It's remarkable for those of us who have never gone to bed hungry or hurt or harmed, who were always sheltered and clothed and fed. Your parents living?
No.
And are they buried on the East Coast?
No. Actually, they made it out to California eventually. 2 or 3 times after I made it, they came back out again. And they're both down in Riverside.
Now, you said your husband and family. I know you have children.
I do. I have 4 children, all grown. 2 of them, my 2 older children, live in Virginia, and they've given me some grandchildren recently, in recent years. So I have 4 grandchildren and 1 on the way. And then my younger children are 11 years younger than my older children, and they're twins. So they've kept me very young. And they are not, one is married, and 1 is not.
Everyone's healthy and doing well.
They are. They are. They're all doing really well.
Has anything ever happened to you better than motherhood?
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
I say that vehemently.
I agree with that as a father. How about your hobbies? Do you have things you do in your spare time?
I love to hike. I love being out in nature. So hiking is a big thing. I don't like to encumber myself with backpacks and things like that. So I like to have my hands free and just walk. That's what I love to do best. I love to garden for that reason. I'd be a farmer if I had enough land to farm.
And are you in good health?
Yes.
Now, one of the things I'm aware of is you have a singing group, or you're involved in a singing group?
No. No, I think you're referring to the Kirtan group that I happened to mention several times. Kirtan group is a group of, Kirtan itself is very much a reflection of my path, which is yoga, which comes from the Indian tradition. And we practice many different techniques that help us to experience God's presence. And Kirtan is one of them because we chant. And chanting is a very personal interaction between the person chanting and God. And so what we do sometimes is we have what's called a kirtan, which is where we chant repeatedly, many chants over and over again for an hour, hour and a half, maybe longer. And just use that whole technique of chanting to increase our inspiration, raise our energy, and give us the divine experience.
And how did you come to your path?
Come to my path? Well, yoga is a vast subject, and many people today know it through its physical practices of asana and pranayama, known as hatha yoga. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. However, many of us come to the practice of yoga from that direction, and that was so for me, because that was what was most obvious back. It's been many years now, over 30 years. But the more I practiced that and began to notice changes in myself, at the same time I was doing a lot of intense Bible study. And I began to realize that as a result of my practice, I became more calm, more centered, more clear of mind. I gained a lot of mental clarity through this practice of asana and meditation and pranayama, which are the postures and the breathing exercises. And I began to develop a really deep respect for what was happening through these ancient practices. They're thousands of years old, and they include the practice of meditation. At that point, I hadn't been introduced to meditation itself. But I already, through those first two techniques, noticed that the change in me helped me to go deeper in my spiritual studies because of that mental clarity that it gave me. And I remember that this was over 3 or 4 years that I really had time to notice these changes. And I would remember we would discuss in our Bible study group what we thought, some passages meant. And then over the days intervening before our next meeting, little by little, I would have these realizations that would help me to say, oh, that's what that means. That's those deeper meanings. That's what that's all about. So I started to put the two together. And I began to realize that the practice of yoga would help enhance any tradition or belief system or whatever spiritual aspiration I might have. So at that point, I decided to become a serious yogi. And I started looking for, a true teacher. And I knew there was a vast body of teachings around this practice that I was only just beginning to learn about. And so that's what brought me to the path of yoga.
And you follow a particular faith or group or?
Well, in the practice of yoga, we don't talk about faith because what we're trying to do is have direct perception. So it's not based on a belief system, it's based on direct experience. And so again, one can practice any outward cultural tradition, any religion, and still be a yogi. So one can be a Christian yogi or a Jewish yogi or a Buddhist yogi or Muslim yogi, it doesn't really matter. Because what we simply do is take those, yoga is considered a philosophy, it's considered a science, but not a religion, because there's no commitment to a belief system. Instead, we can have our own belief system, whatever that might be, but we take those techniques of asana, pranayama, kirtan, affirmations, meditation, standard techniques known to many traditions, but we take them and focus on them and approach them in a very deliberate, disciplined way. And that, as I said, through the years has been an enormous bonus in helping me to gain spiritual realization that might have taken a lot longer if I didn't know these practices. So yes, I follow a guru, Paramahansa Yogananda. He came to America in 1920, long before the 60s when a lot of Indian teachers came. So he was one of the first ones. And he's highly regarded in our field, in the field of yoga. He wrote a great classic known as Autobiography of a Yogi that was published in 1946. And it's a very well-known book and used in many college classes, and many people read it. It doesn't mean that everybody who reads it becomes a disciple of Yogananda, but his book gives a broad overview of what yoga is all about. And that's the great blessing and gift that he gave to people in in writing that book.
Now, I sat with you in a gathering some months ago. It was an Ananda gathering. Was I in church?
You know, I think many of us coming through the 60s who didn't, a lot of people, I'm not saying me myself, because I've always been comfortable with church. Growing up as a Roman Catholic, I loved being in church. I don't have any resistance to that concept. And I never turned my back on it as I became a yogi. I just took it with me. But for a lot of people, the idea of church has negative connotations for them. For whatever reason, that concept didn't work for them. And so a lot of people don't like to consider Ananda as a church. As a legal body, it is a church. It's a legal entity as a church body. But it's not so much, the emphasis is not so much on the institution as it is on the inner path. That's what yoga is really all about. So we tend not to emphasize it in that way.
That was a very pleasurable experience for me. There was good teaching and good music and the chanting and other sorts of things that was satisfying and relaxing.
The path is very joyful. It's all about joy. It's not about, it's a path that doesn't say, as in the past, many paths have said, through pain and suffering you can know God. In the yoga path, it's through joy and self-discipline and self-control that you can know God.
Now, could you travel anywhere else in the United States or internationally and find a group like that on a
Absolutely.
morning?
In fact, Yogananda is known worldwide, and there are Yogananda meditation groups and centers around the world. But then there are also Ananda meditation groups and centers around the world. I'm connected to the Ananda group, which was founded by Swami Kriyananda, who was a direct disciple, is a direct disciple. He's elderly now, but he's just turned 84. He was a direct disciple. He was with the master. And he came in 1948, and Yogananda passed away in 1952. So he had 4 years of direct training with Yogananda. And so it's been a great joy for us. Swami Kriyananda started the Ananda community up in Nevada City, and that's been around now for 40 years. He started in the 60s. And it's a wonderful place for people to go and to spend some time there. It's a community, you can live there, and it gives you a chance to develop your practice and establish yourself in the spiritual life.
Does the finding of yourself in this practice qualify as spiritual?
Absolutely.
And what would you say is the huge difference between spirituality and organized religion?